Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. This week, I take a look at a covenant between a family. The lesson comes from Ruth, the first chapter, verses 6 through 11 and 14 through 18. In this lesson, we see women who are ethnically different. They worship different gods, they have different customs, and they have different cultures. Yet something binds these women together more powerfully than their differences could separate. In this lesson, Ruth leaves everything she knows, all of her traditions, all of her practices, and all of her people to go with Naomi. What this highlights for me is the powerful way in which Naomi must have impacted Ruth. This mother-in-law must have had a profound, deep, intense, and life-changing impact on her daughter-in-law for her to leave everyone and everything she was accustomed to. Ruth knows that she is a Moabite, and Israelites look down on and almost always have nothing to do with Moabites. But still, she clings to her mother-in-law. She clings because there's something more powerful than the pain of living among people who don't like you because of your ancestry. She clings because there's something more powerful than suffering because there is no man in your home. These two women have a bond of love. It's this love that becomes a mother-daughter covenant, a covenant that we all should strive to emulate in our own relationships. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms redeemer and widow. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. With Wi-Fi, you can start and stop the lesson when and where you want to for discussion. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. I'd also like to thank the new subscribers that have joined over the last few weeks. I especially want to thank the subscribers I met last week at the Jude 3 Project's Courageous Conversations in Atlanta, Georgia. If you like this channel, you'll probably enjoy the Courageous Conversations panels on various topics as well. I'll leave a link in the description below. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. First, we'll look at the background for today's text. This week's lesson is the first of two lessons from the book of Ruth. Nelson's Bible Handbook notes that its author, Ruth's author, is unknown, although some scholars credit it to the prophet Samuel. The New Interpreter Study Bible notes that Christian Bibles place Ruth in between Judges and Samuel. And this leads the reader directly from the era when there was no king in Israel. Judges, the 21st chapter, verse 25. There was no king in Israel, and the people did as they saw fit in their own eyes, to the time of David. So Ruth leads you from the time when there was no king to the time of the exemplary king David, which is noted in Ruth, the 4th chapter, verses 17 through 22. The Hebrew Bible, unlike the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible instead places Ruth among the writings. Townsend commentary notes that Ruth begins during the closing days of Judges. Judges was a 400-year timeline of anarchy and oppression during which the Israelites were not ruled by kings, but rather had judges who were deliverers, whom God periodically raised up to deliver Israel. Judges closes with, "There was no king in Israel." Ruth takes us from the anarchy of no king to the time of the great king, David. Perhaps the strongest theological point in Ruth is the idea of the Redeemer, and specifically the kinsman Redeemer. Although this book is named Ruth, it tells the story of Naomi. Naomi lived in Bethlehem in the time of the judges. A famine drives Naomi and her family to seek refuge across the border in Moab, where her two sons marry, or really abduct, Moabite women as wives. When Naomi's husband and sons die, she returns to Bethlehem, destitute, bitter, and empty, but accompanied by her Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. That's a quote from the New Interpreter Study Bible. Again, this book is named Ruth, but it's really the story of Naomi. It's Naomi who, as the NISB says, it's Naomi who needs redemption, and ultimately she receives it. It's Naomi's life that is renewed. Her feelings of bitterness, emptiness, and hopelessness are turned around. Like Naomi, we are the recipients of unmerited love, and our redemption is due to someone else's faithfulness, not our own. It's also important to note the full context in which Ruth pledges her love to Naomi. Dr. Will Gaffney writes in the Africana Bible, reading Israel's scriptures from Africa and the African diaspora, that Ruth's embrace of Naomi is particularly striking, remembering that they were from different ethnic communities, practiced different religions, and Naomi was there and presumably did not object when Ruth and Orpah were abducted into marriage. So Ruth really leaves everything she knows. She leaves all of her traditions and practices and people to go with Naomi. What this highlights for me is the impact that Naomi must have had on Ruth. This mother-in-law had a profound, deep, and intense impact on her daughter-in-law for her to leave everyone and everything she was accustomed to. Our text this week is focused on a covenant between a family that's ethnically different but bound in love nonetheless. Ruth is marginalized as a Moabite and as a widowed or unmarried woman. She knows she'll likely be unwelcome in Bethlehem. The Israelites don't like nor do they get along with the Moabites. Yet her love for her mother-in-law compels her to go anyway. Some important words to consider in this from this text include, as I said earlier, redeemer and widow. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week was the first in a series of lessons that deal with covenants between people. As we saw in last week, and we'll see again in this week's lesson, love is a significant theme that drives these covenants. Last week's lesson was taken from 1 Samuel chapters 18 and 19. The love that secured the covenant between Jonathan and his friend David was the central theme. Chapter 18 began with a continuation of the David and Goliath story. In verse 1, David had, in verse 1, David had already killed Goliath and presented Goliath's head to King Saul. Presented Goliath's head to Saul. David was seen as a hero, and of course this bothered King Saul. David had single-handedly won the war and defeated the Philistine enemy of Israel. Verse 1 told us that the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. Townsend commentary notes that the traditional mainstream view of the relationship between David and Jonathan is that it was platonic, brotherly love. Verse 2 helped us understand that Saul was pleased with David because Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Verses 3 and 4 helped us understand that understand that Jonathan and David had a mutual agreement. They made a covenant. Verse 3 told us that Jonathan loved David as his own soul, and the terms of the covenant, the terms of their covenant are not mentioned, but based on the actions of Jonathan in verse 4, we can consider Jonathan's loyalty to David surpassed his own claim to the throne. Verse 5 helped us understand David's obedience and wisdom. David conducted himself wisely. He was successful in all that Saul put before him. He was so successful that all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. And the fact that even the servants approved really says something about the fame and celebrity and prominence of David. That same fame and prominence is what would make King Saul jealous. And then at this point, the lesson skipped to chapter 19. I noted that between verses 6 and the beginning of chapter 19, a lot transpires. Townsend commentary noted the events of 1 Samuel 18 through 20 occurred between 1018 and 1013 BC, and David would have been between 15 and 22 years old. He spent approximately 7 years living with King Saul before Saul began trying to kill him. Additionally, there is a 25-year age gap between David and Jonathan. Verse 1 of chapter 19 tells us that Saul speaks to Jonathan and to all his servants that they should kill David. Saul is jealous of David, and this jealousy is the basis of his hatred for David without cause. Verse 2 of chapter 19 told us of Jonathan's treason against his father Saul. Jonathan's love for David and his covenant with David means more to him than carrying out the wishes of his father, the king. Jonathan warns David and advises him to hide in a secret place until morning. Verses 3, 4, and 5 detail the plan Jonathan came up with to save his friend and how with courage and commitment Jonathan spoke truth to power. If warning David was treason, reporting his private conversation with the king surely was. Verse 4 shows Jonathan speaking up for and on behalf of David, his friend. In verse 5, Jonathan reminds his father that the king, that David is innocent. In this way, Jonathan showed his true loyalty. He risked his own life for the safety of his friend. He spoke truth to power. He was courageous and committed to the covenant he made with David. Verse 6 and 7 reveal the results of Jonathan's plea to his father. Saul listened to his son and swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be slain." Jonathan took the risk for his friend, and in this occasion it was worth it. It was a tremendous risk for Jonathan. He had to choose between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his friend. As Jonathan noted, David was innocent. Jonathan chose to stand up for what was right. His loyalty was to his friend, but his loyalty was also to what was right. This week's lesson deals with another covenant based in love. David and Jonathan's love is through friendship. Naomi and Ruth's love is based in family. Although the family circle has been broken with death of the husbands of Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, the love Ruth demonstrates to her mother-in-law is just as powerful as any other. Townsend, Boyd's, and Standard Lesson Commentary title the lesson, A Mother-Daughter Covenant. The scripture text comes from Ruth, the first chapter, verses 6 through 11 and 14 through 18. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled Naomi and Her Moabite Daughters-in-Law. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not press me to leave you or to return back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So, what takes place in this passage? Leading up to verse 6, we learn the time frame of this story is when the judges ruled. There was a famine in Judah, and Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons left their home country and crossed into Moab. The New Interpreter Study Bible notes that Bethlehem means house of bread or house of food. Yet at this time there is no food due to the famine. Elimelech, his name means my God is king. And that's ironic in contrast to the end of Judges, which states that there was no king in Israel. Malon and Chilion sound like the Hebrew words for diseased and perishing. It suggests that the sons are likely to die young. And Naomi means sweet or pleasant, an ironic contrast to the bitterness she'll face in life. After living in Moab for some time, Elimelech dies. And after living there about 10 years more, the two sons also die. When verse 6 picks up, Dr. Will Gaffney writes in the Africana Bible, Naomi is a postmenopausal widow, bereft of her childless sons. Naomi has no male family left. I inserted the term male. But she has a home. She returned to her people, the land of her ancestors. Verse 6 and 7 tell us that Naomi with her daughters-in-law start the return home because she has heard that the Lord has given Judah food. Verses 8 and 9 tell us that Naomi told her daughters-in-law to go back to your mother's house. The NISB notes that using the term mother's house is an indication that Naomi is urging them to look for new husbands. And it's here that we get the first glimpse of the kind of woman that Naomi is. She tells these two daughters-in-law, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you've dealt with me, as you've dealt with the dead and with me." Regardless of Naomi's motivation for sending them back, she wishes them well and acknowledges how they've treated her dead sons and how they've treated her as their mother-in-law. In verse 9, she wishes that they will find security in the homes of their new husbands. The NISB notes that in their world, marriage was assumed to be the only respectable way for a woman to achieve social and economic security. In a male-dominated patriarchal society, these husbandless women and this sonless mother would have had a hard time just to survive. After Naomi kisses them, they all wept aloud. But surely this isn't the first time they have wept aloud together. These women have experienced great trials and tribulations. They've experienced the death of their husbands and Naomi's sons. And they have likely faced the struggles of providing for themselves without their husbands. Verses 10 and 11 tell us again that Naomi wants them to look for other husbands. Naomi tells them, "Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands?" Naomi knows how hard it is to survive without a husband, and she believes it would be best for them to find other husbands. And this is really Naomi looking out for their best interests. This is Naomi showing them love. She knows she can do little to nothing to make life better for her daughters-in-law. The lesson text skips to verse 14, where again they wept aloud. Naomi is heartbroken. She's distressed and probably destitute, and by her own words, she's bitter. She has a mind set on returning to her home, and she knows that she has nothing to offer her daughters-in-law. Orpah is convinced of her mother-in-law's argument. It's logical. It makes sense. And she knows Naomi is speaking from a place of love. Orpah departs from Naomi and returns to her people. She returns to her culture and to her gods. But Ruth clings to Naomi. She knows Naomi is speaking the truth. She knows she has nothing really to look forward to. She knows that she is a Moabite, and Israelites look down on and almost always have nothing to do with Moabites. But still she clings to her mother-in-law. She clings because there's something more powerful than the pain of living among people who don't like you because of your ancestry. She clings because there's something more powerful than suffering because there's no man in your home. She clings because there's something more powerful than the sorrow she's already faced and the hardships she's likely to face. She clings because she loves this woman. She loves her mother-in-law more than the comfort of living with her own people. She clings because she loves this woman more than the familiarity of her own customs and her own gods. She clings because Naomi is a woman who has no doubt shown Ruth the kind of love that transcends customs. Naomi has shown her a love that transcends culture. And for Ruth, Naomi's love transcends familiarity. In verses 16 and 17, Ruth speaks the words that are so often repeated in marriage ceremonies. These words are Ruth's unequivocal love for her mother-in-law. Ruth is going to cling to Naomi regardless of what may come. Wherever she goes, wherever she lives, whatever God she serves, and wherever she dies, Ruth declares that the same will be to her. These are certainly beautiful words, and I remember them repeated in my own wedding years ago. While the sentiment is certainly appreciated, respected, and esteemed, we should be mindful of the context. The New Interpreter Study Bible notes that these words, spoken by one woman to another woman, must be taken out of context in order to be used as a pledge of love between a man and a woman. Yet it is this sentiment, and it is the deep meaning of this kind of love that we all ought to strive for in our marriage relationships. This is Ruth's covenant with Naomi. Verse 18 closes our lesson with Naomi resigned to Ruth's commitment. Naomi realizes that Ruth is determined and committed, not just to go with her, but to demonstrate her love toward her. That should be our goal, to demonstrate our love for one another in ways that leaves no doubt about our care and concern. So let's give the text some context. Do you have a friend or family member that will do anything they can for you? Do you have someone who will walk the last mile with you? Do you have someone who will stand by you and support you through thick and thin? Do you have a ride or die? Do you have someone that loves you unconditionally? Do you have someone who gives you unmerited love? All of this and more is what Ruth is to Naomi. This book bears the name of Ruth, but Naomi is the real MVP. Ruth gets credit for demonstrating her undying love for her mother-in-law, but it's Naomi who impacted her daughter-in-law in ways to warrant that kind of love. I can think of no strength, no power, and no purpose stronger than love. Love can cause you to sacrifice yourself for the ones you love. Love is the greatest power in the universe. That's what this mother-daughter covenant is. It's a covenant based in love. As followers of Jesus Christ, our love should be so strong, so unmistakable, so committed, and so devoted that our loved ones will know we are their ride or die. Key characters in the text. Of course, Naomi is one of the key characters. Naomi can be defined as the mother-in-law of Ruth and wife of Elimelech. Her name means sweet or pleasant, but she becomes bitter toward God after the death of her husband and 2 sons. She's later redeemed and the sweetness of her life restored. Ruth is another central character. Ruth is a Moabite woman who becomes the grandmother of King David and in the bloodline of Jesus Christ. Ruth demonstrates her undying love for her mother-in-law Naomi, and through her, she becomes Naomi's redemption. Keywords, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. One keyword would be redeemer. A redeemer is defined as God as the rescuer and recoverer of Israel. This is a designation for Jesus Christ, who brings salvation and the redemptive relationship God intends to have with those who believe. Widows is another key word. Widows can be defined as women who remained unmarried after the death of their husbands, and they were of special concern in ancient Israel as powerless persons. You can see Exodus, the 22nd chapter, verse 22. They were recipients of Christian care by churches in Acts, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 3, and 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be, who are you writing for? Who are you writing for? Ruth would ride for Naomi. And then a second might be, don't sleep on Naomi. Many people overlook the significance of Naomi's character and the significance of Naomi's life and impact on Ruth. This book bears the name of Ruth, but Naomi is the real MVP. Questions that you might ask in your class. Ruth was a Moabite who was likely abducted into marriage. She knew Israelites frowned upon and did not like Moabites. Does Ruth rely on faith that things will work out? Or does she simply love her mother-in-law regardless of how things will work out? Discuss. A second question may be, Ruth, a Moabite woman, becomes the ancestress of King David and thereby Jesus. What does this say about racial purity? And then a concluding thought. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. Ruth's love for Naomi is a demonstration of what love can do. It can cause a person to willingly sacrifice their own comfort and convenience for the sake of someone else. This is the kind of love God demonstrated for us through Jesus Christ. God sacrificed God's only begotten Son for our salvation and redemption. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week, we continue our study in the book of Ruth. And as we continue to learn about covenants between people, we explore how virtuous Ruth charms Boaz and becomes the grandmother of King David. Next week, the text comes from Ruth, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 6, verses 8 through 12, and verses 16 through 18. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe or click the like button or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.